It was late October, just a few weeks ago. My name is Maya, and I'd only been in my new apartment for 3 days when it happened. I moved in fast, after a breakup that left me needing space, literally and otherwise. The building was new, barely finished, and most of the units were still empty. I was the first tenant on my floor. No neighbors, no noise, just me and a few boxes. The first days were a blur of unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. I kept telling myself I'd get used to the quiet, but at night, every sound felt amplified. Pipes settling, wind against the glass, the hum of the fridge. I'd always wanted to live alone, but I never realized how loud empty could be. I'd picked this place because it was close to work, and because the rent was cheap for something so new. The leasing agent had shown me around, apologizing for the unfinished landscaping and the echo in the empty halls. "You'll have neighbors soon," she'd promised. But for now, it was just me and the construction dust. I told myself I liked the solitude. After the breakup, I needed it. I needed to prove to myself that I could be on my own, that I could start over. The first night, I barely slept. Every time the building creaked, I jolted awake, convinced someone was in the apartment. By the second night, I was exhausted enough to sleep through anything. But by the third, the novelty had worn off, and the silence started to feel oppressive. I tried to fill it with music, with the TV, with the sound of my own voice talking to no one as I unpacked. That third night, I was on the couch half watching a movie, half scrolling through my phone, when I noticed a man standing under the streetlight across the road. He had his hands in his pockets, just staring up at the building. I know what you're probably thinking. How could I be sure he was looking at me? The truth is, I was the only one here. The other windows were dark. No curtains, no lights, no furniture. I'd moved in before anyone else, so if he was looking at any window, it was mine. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was waiting for a ride, or just out for a smoke. But he didn't move. Not for 5 minutes, not for 10. Just stood there, head tilted up, unmoving. I kept glancing at him, hoping he'd leave. But he didn't. I started to feel exposed, like a bug under a microscope. I pulled my knees up to my chest and tried to focus on the movie, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. I thought about messaging my ex, the only person I knew nearby, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. We hadn't talked much since the breakup, and I didn't want to give him the wrong idea. Instead, I just sat there, phone in hand, watching the man outside. I checked the locks, told myself it was just nerves, new place, new neighborhood. But every time I glanced out, he was still there, head tilted up, unmoving. Eventually, I closed the curtains and turned up the TV, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got sharper. I kept thinking I heard footsteps in the hallway, or a faint tap at the back door. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a stray cat. But the sense of being watched wouldn't leave. I tried to distract myself, made tea, scrolled through old photos, anything to keep my mind off the man outside. I even started to clean, wiping down the counters and rearranging the few things I'd unpacked. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see his face pressed against the glass. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I even laughed out loud, just to break the tension. It was almost midnight when I heard a metallic rattle from the back of the apartment. I froze, mug halfway to my lips. The sound came again, a little louder, like someone testing the door handle. I set the mug down, heart pounding, and crept down the hallway. The kitchen was dark, except for the glow from the streetlights. I stood there holding my breath, listening. The rattle stopped, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. I checked the lock, still latched. I pressed my ear to the door, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I tried to laugh it off, but my hands were shaking. I went back to the living room, turned the TV up, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. I picked up my phone, finally deciding to message my ex. I figured he was the closest person, and right then, I just needed someone to know I was scared. I typed out a message, my fingers trembling. But before I could hit send, the quiet was shattered by a sudden, heavy pounding at the front door. Not the careful testing knock from before. This was urgent, desperate. And then I heard my name, shouted through the door. I recognized the voice instantly. I ran to the door and opened it. My ex was standing there, out of breath, rainwater dripping from his jacket. He looked past me, scanning the hallway, then said he'd seen a man running from my door as he pulled up. He asked if I was okay, if anyone had tried to get in. I nodded, still shaking, and let him inside. For the first time all night, I felt safe. He stayed for a while, checking the locks, walking through the apartment with me. We sat at the kitchen table, drinking the tea I'd made earlier, and talked about nothing in particular. He tried to make me laugh, to distract me from what had just happened. Eventually, when things felt calm again, he left. I watched him go, the hallway empty behind him. But later, as I was cleaning up, I noticed something by the back steps, muddy footprints, the same size and shape as the ones I'd seen earlier. The rain had washed most of them away, but one print remained, right where my ex had stood when he left. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the tread looked familiar, almost identical to the ones I'd seen outside my door earlier that night. I haven't seen the stranger since that night. Sometimes I wonder if it was just a coincidence, if my ex really did scare someone off, but I never told him my new address. I never sent that message, and I still don't know who was really at my door that night, or why. The next morning, I packed a bag and went to stay at my parents' house for a while. I told them I just needed a break from the city, that I wanted to see them, but I didn't mention the man under the streetlight, or the way my ex had shown up just in time. I just needed to feel safe again, to sleep through the night without jumping at every sound. My name is Mateo Alvarez. I'd come up from Sacramento to house sit for my friend Jamie, who just landed a new job and was away at a training seminar in Seattle. I remember it was the week before Thanksgiving, mostly because I'd been planning to drive back down for the holiday, and I was counting the days. Jamie's place was a blue Craftsman on a quiet street in Selwood, tucked between two big maples that dropped leaves everywhere. The house was old, with floors that creaked and a backyard that always smelled like wet rosemary. I liked the neighborhood, quiet, friendly, the kind of place where people still left pumpkins on their porches even after Halloween. The neighbors waved, but mostly kept to themselves. I didn't mind. I was just there to water Jamie's plants, bring in the mail, and keep an eye on things. The first few days were uneventful. I worked from Jamie's kitchen table, made coffee in her French press, and tried to settle into the rhythm of the place. I'd take walks in the evening just to clear my head, and sometimes I'd see the same old man shuffling down the sidewalk, always in a green rain jacket, always with his head down. He never looked up, never waved, just kept moving at his own slow pace. I figured he was just a neighbor, maybe someone who'd lived there forever. One night stands out, mostly because it rained so hard. The gutters overflowed, and the streetlights flickered. I remember it was a Thursday, because I'd spent the afternoon on a long call with my boss, and was looking forward to doing nothing. I was reading in the living room, the windows cracked for the smell of rain, when I heard a knock at the door. Not loud, just enough to make me look up. I opened the door, and found the old man from the sidewalk standing on the porch. He didn't say much at first, just looked past me, into the house, like he was searching for something. I asked if he needed help, and after a pause, he asked if someone named Sarah was home. I told him I was just house-sitting, that I didn't know a Sarah, and he seemed to accept that, but he kept glancing over my shoulder, like he expected to see someone else. He left without another word, but the way he lingered on the porch made me uneasy. I watched him walk down the steps and disappear into the rain. I tried to shake it off, but I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at the house, not at me. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the front door. No envelope, just a piece of lined paper folded in half. It said, in shaky handwriting, "Sarah, please call me. I need to talk to you." No phone number, just that message. I almost laughed, thinking maybe the old man was confused. Maybe he'd mixed up the houses, but the note felt deliberate, like he knew exactly where he was leaving it. That night, I double-checked the locks before bed. I told myself it was just a weird coincidence, that he'd figure it out and stop coming by. But just after midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch again. This time, I didn't answer. I just stood in the hallway, heart pounding, watching the shadow of his feet under the door. He knocked, waited, then knocked again, harder. I could hear him muttering, but I couldn't make out the words. He left eventually, but not before I heard him walk around the side of the house, his footsteps crunching through the wet leaves. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening for any sound, any sign that he'd come back. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the back step, leading up to the kitchen door. They were too big to be mine, and I hadn't used that door since I arrived. I texted Jamie, asking if she knew anyone named Sarah, or if there was some story about the house I should know. She replied later, confused, saying she'd never heard of a Sarah and that the house had been empty for months before she moved in. I tried to go about my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed a window, I caught myself glancing outside and half expecting to see the old man standing there. That evening, I heard the mail slot rattle and found another note. This one just a single word. "Please." I started to wonder if I was missing something, if maybe Jamie's house had a history she didn't know about. I even looked up the address online, searching for anything, old listings, news stories, anything that might explain why someone would keep coming back, looking for a woman who didn't live there. I found nothing. No mention of a Sarah, no stories about the house, just a string of old real estate listings, and a few blurry photos from years ago. The last night before Jamie came home, I heard footsteps in the backyard again. The motion light flicked on, and for a second, I saw the old man standing by the fence, staring at the house. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched. I called out, telling him to leave, but he didn't react. He just turned and disappeared into the shadows. When Jamie got back, I handed her the keys and told her everything. She laughed it off, said Portland was full of weirdos, but I could tell she was unsettled. I left that afternoon, drove back to Sacramento, and tried not to think about the man on the porch. A few months later, Jamie texted me out of the blue. She said she'd found another note on her porch. Same shaky handwriting, still asking for Sarah. She hadn't seen the old man herself, but a neighbor mentioned he still walked the block, always pausing in front of her house, always looking up at the windows. I guess he's still out there, searching for someone who never lived there, or maybe someone who left a long time ago. I don't know if he'll ever stop looking, and I still wonder what he thinks he'll find, or if he even knows anymore. I've lived in a lot of apartments, but this was the first time I ever felt like my space wasn't really mine. This happened about 4 years ago, when I was 24, living in a mid-rise building in St. Louis. The place was nothing special, just a bunch of identical beige doors, faded carpet in the halls, and a laundry room that always smelled like burnt dryer sheets and old coins. I worked nights at a warehouse, so I was used to coming home when most people were asleep. The building quiet except for the hum of someone's TV through the walls. Things got strange after the building switched management companies. Suddenly, there were new maintenance guys everywhere. I'd see them in the halls at all hours, sometimes just standing around, sometimes carrying tools, sometimes just watching. At first, I chalked it up to the usual chaos that comes with new management. Maintenance is always around when you least want them to be. I figured they were just getting used to the building, or maybe the new owners were trying to make a good impression by fixing everything at once. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. I'd come home and find my mail stacked differently than I left it. My shoes by the door would be moved just a little, never far, but always off from where I remembered. Once, I found a sticky note on my fridge that said, "Call for filter." I never wrote it, and I never called anyone. I don't even know what filter it was talking about. One evening, I got home and found my bathroom window open. I never touched that window. It was painted shut when I moved in, and I'd never bothered to force it. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to come up with any explanation that made sense. Maybe the painters came back, maybe someone from maintenance needed to check something, but there was no note, no sign anyone had been in the apartment, just that window, open a few inches, letting in the sticky summer air. After that, I started paying closer attention. I'd leave little things in certain places, my keys on the counter, a book on the coffee table, just to see if they'd move. Sometimes they did, not every day, but enough that I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I even started taking pictures with my phone before I left for work, just to have proof for myself. A few days later, I was making dinner when I heard someone at my door. Not knocking, more like someone working the lock, slow and careful. I froze, spatula in hand, and listened. The sound stopped, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw a guy in a blue maintenance shirt walking away, jangling a ring of keys. He didn't look at me, just kept his head down and disappeared around the corner. I watched him go, heart pounding, and waited a few minutes before opening the door. There was nothing there. That's when I started taking precautions. I bought a cheap camera and set it up facing my front door. I double-checked the locks every night, even wedged a chair under the doorknob before bed. I started keeping a notebook, jotting down anything that seemed off. I mentioned it to a couple friends, but they just shrugged it off. But the feeling that someone was coming into my apartment when I wasn't there wouldn't go away. One night, I stayed up late, just to see if anything would happen. Around 2 a.m., footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and heavy. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, listening. There was a soft click, like a key turning. Then, nothing. No footsteps walking away. Just silence. I sat there in the dark, barely breathing, until I finally heard the elevator doors open and close at the end of the hall. The next morning, I checked the camera. The battery was dead. I know I'd charged it the day before. I called the building manager and asked if maintenance had been scheduled for my unit. She checked and told me no one was supposed to be in my apartment that week. I described the guy I'd seen, and she got real quiet. Said she'd look into it. A few days later, the locks on all the apartments were changed, and the building sent out a notice about a security issue. They never gave any details, and I never found out who that guy was or what he was doing in my apartment. But for weeks after, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard someone at the door, just waiting for me to fall asleep. I moved out a month later. Packing up, I found another sticky note wedged behind the fridge. This one just said, "Check vent." I never figured out what that meant. I left the chair wedged under the doorknob on my last night, just in case. It wasn't until months later, after I'd moved in with a friend across town, that I got a call from the old building's manager. She sounded nervous, almost apologetic. She told me they'd finally figured out what had been going on. One of the new maintenance guys had been using his master key to get into apartments when tenants were at work or asleep. He wasn't stealing anything, at least, not in the usual sense. Instead, he was obsessed with the building's old ventilation system. He'd been crawling through the vents, leaving notes for himself, and sometimes just sitting in people's apartments, listening to the air move through the ducts. The call for filter note, the check vent message, they were reminders for himself, left in random units. The open window, the moved shoes, the mail, just side effects of someone who didn't belong, moving through spaces that weren't his. The manager said he'd been fired, and the police had been notified, but nothing ever came of it. No charges, no real explanation. Just a quiet warning to the rest of us to always lock our doors and report anything strange. I still don't know what he was looking for in those vents, or why he picked my apartment more than once. But I haven't lived alone since. And every time I hear keys jingling in a hallway, I get that same feeling in my gut, like someone's about to let themselves in.